Hello, everybody. So, I've temporarily shut off the AC in this room so that I can do the live read without having the AC unit cause too much noise. But we missed Tuesday because of moving to our new apartment, and we missed out on the 4th of July because it was the 4th of July, and I just didn't really have the time or energy to do it. So, this is a quick catch-up episode to get through Chapter 4, and then tomorrow I will probably still do a live read, but it will not be at 3 o'clock because of the U.S. Women's final World Cup final game, which I want to watch live and support the U.S. Women's team. So because of that, it will either be earlier, later, or on Monday. And I will probably make that decision sometime around 11 or 12 Eastern. So for Chapter 4 as a recap, we're starting off in the Endless Sands where Wrath has led Trem, Logan, etc., and learning a little bit more about exactly what it is that Wrath had to do in order to get them there. So, Logan, despite having been on guard earlier in the evening, rose just as dawn was creeping over the dunes around the meager oasis. He could see Joven sitting out on the far side of the shallow water, watching as the sun rose before him. He also saw, as the light was spreading across the sand, that some distance past the water, Wrath was standing on the tallest dune, unmoving, clearly waiting for someone or something. Logan walked ponderously up the sand to Joven's position, taking a seat beside him. Javenileth did not look at his friend, but kept his eyes on Wrath's form in the distance. They said nothing as they sat and watched, and they did not have to wait long. The other forms of black cloth materialized alongside Wrath, 3 to each side of him. The soft winds of the desert blew back their long robes as one approached him, and they clasped forearms. The 2 stood like that a while, so unmoving they could have been statues, and then with alarming swiftness the whole mass of black-robed figures turned and came down the dune towards the oasis. Logan and Joven stood and made ready to greet the new arrivals, who were soon upon them and arrayed in a semicircle about the 2 foreigners. Wrath, who Joven recognized from his large crossbow visible under his folds of cloth, waved his hand towards the 2 from Lagotia and spoke to another Malarian, who was clearly the leader. Their language was oddly melodic, and in truth Joven found it quite beautiful, though he understood none of it. The 2 talked very briefly, and all Logan could discern was that Wrath was explaining to his fellows who they were. The other figure was clearly female, given her high-pitched voice and lightness of tone. She stepped forward and removed her head wrap, revealing a youthful face and shaven head. She did not smile or scowl. Her expression was impassive, but she spoke calm and clearly and directly. Wrath Ib Althor Ein Elman tells me you are good men and have abided by our laws in this place. We will take you and your people to another oasis, further south, which is known to have water all the year. There are plants there which can be eaten, and you are welcome to them. There was no delay from the new arrivals. The leader wrapped her head in black cloth once more, and they fanned out to the south while Logan and Joven went to rouse the others. The refugees were unhappy to be on the move again, but Wrath assured them the distance was not far. They were trudging across the sand within the hour, and before the sun had reached its zenith, they spotted the larger oasis with brilliant blue water and many plants growing about it. There were more black-clad figures there, and some others, with scattered tents and flags denoting who hailed from where. Ghost had paused atop the dune, offering the best vantage point, and was studying the camp below. Diaga came up beside him, leaning heavily on his staff. It seems like a far better place to rest. It does, Ghost agreed, but I have little time for such luxuries. The 2 began the descent slowly as the shifting sands beneath their feet made climbing down mildly hazardous. Neep came bounding along behind them and soon had overtaken the entire group. Since she had been in the south, she had come alive. The heat did not drain her like the others. She felt invigorated and stronger than ever before. As she went flying over the sand, she slowed, seeing other shapes below that looked oddly familiar. Perching atop a low dune, looking into the encampment, she saw other firecats of brilliant furs from yellow and orange to deep and rusty red. Utterly stunned, she stood there, staring, unable to believe her eyes. Behind her, a gentle hand stroked her fur, and she turned to see Kaliandra, looking down as well. I thought there might be more of your kind here, the priestess said. The sands are home to many firecats. Neep whined softly, and to Kaliandra's surprise, she stole off to the right and went down in the shadows of the larger hills of sand and out of view. Diaga came up beside Kaliandra and watched Neep in confusion. Where is she going? I'm not sure. She seems to not be interested in the other firecats. The 2 exchanged a concerned look and then decided to follow Neep's path. The men and women from Malaria had preceded their arrival, and the small party was now speaking to another black-robed figure with an immensely tall leader holding a huge spear. Wrath stood before him, gesturing and speaking in his native tongue, and when he was finished the large man said nothing. Then he suddenly struck Wrath viciously across the face with his fist, nearly dropping the other man to his knees. But Wrath caught himself and, with impressive stoicism, returned to his standing position and placed his hands behind his back. Joven watched the exchange, but before he could make sense of it, he saw Logan running across the packed sand around the encampment and stepping between Wrath and his assailant just as he readied for another blow. Stop this, Logan said, extending his hands toward the larger figure. Whatever oaths Wrath violated, I'll be the one to receive his punishment. Wrath hissed at him from his rigid pose of acceptance. Stand aside, knight. This is the law. It's not my law. I won't allow it. It's not your land, the voice of the larger figure boomed over Logan, and the Anglo-Daik turned to look up at the glaring eyes wrapped in black cloth. Wrath Ibathor Ein-Elman is a watcher. He is subject to the ruling of his peers. His cause has been heard, his violations weighed, and the forgiveness he has asked for granted. You will be guests here, free of tribute, but he will pay the price. What forgiveness is this? Logan demanded. You're beating him. It was the exchange he offered, 1 blow for every 10 of you that he has brought here. He will accept it, and you must also. It is against our laws to bring outsiders who cannot offer tribute to Yulinar, the Great Library. But Wrath Ibathor Ein-Elman praised you, even though he defied our masters by letting one of your number live. If you interfere now, you will be cast back into the endless sands and not allowed to return ever again. Let it be, knight, Wrath said softly. Logan, despite his anger, knew there was nothing he could do. He made himself stand there and watch, flinching at every blow, as the other watchers of Yulinar took turns kicking and punching Wrath all about his body until he'd received the ordained beating. He managed to hold his ground for much of it, but the last dozen or so he could no longer get to his feet and had to lean on one knee. When it was over, the large leader bowed to Logan and said, You may seat him now if you wish, knight. He has paid the required price nobly. Logan rushed to Wrath and tried to help him stand, but the Malarian weakly pushed him away. He removed his head wrap with obvious pain and spat a great stream of blood onto the sand. Get the healer. Logan did not have to go far. Caliandra was tending to the refugees and making certain everyone was comfortable. She came running when Logan told her what had happened. They found Wrath, the trail of spattered blood marking his way, leaning against a thick palm tree by the water. He turned his head, one eye completely shut from the blows he'd received, and incredibly, smiled at both of them. Caliandra staved off any conversation and grasped his head firmly. The Malarian gasped and arched his back, but the blood dried up, and some receded as the swelling about his face also shrank. Caliandra swooned a bit in the sun, and Wrath's hand shot out to catch her. You should not expend yourself for me, priestess. Caliandra recovered somewhat and leaned on Logan for support. I think it's no more than I can do after what you went through for us. What was that about, Wrath? Logan asked. You took a beating just so we could stay here? Not just you, Wrath explained. Your charges needed to be able to stay as well. In the Dominion of Malaria, those who come from outsider lands must pay for the privilege, and the cost is both high and often viewed as unusual by outsiders. We don't care for gold, silver, or precious gems, for we have those in abundance. Malarians, and especially those of Yulinar, crave knowledge and items of rarity. Bring something unique to us, something we need, and you are granted permission to use the oases and, in very rare cases, to visit the city. Some spend their entire lives trying to find one object that will let them look on the gilded spires of my home. Logan frowned. You're saying we need to dig up some ancient artifact in order to enter Yulinar? No, Wrath adjusted himself to rest against the tree more comfortably. In your case, Trem Waterhound is enough of a fascination to grant him and some others entry. You will meet one traveler and one listener here at the Oasis, and they will determine who may enter Yulinar. What do you mean, traveler and listener? Caliandra asked. Wrath looked at her and seemed puzzled. Did you not encounter them when you left your home in the Haven Isles? Perhaps you never went near Khazar in the south of the sands. I and my brothers and sisters are watchers, charged with defending our home from outsiders. The travelers go out in the world and gather news and information from our people, for our people, reporting back after an allotted time or once they have learned something of use to us. Listeners, Wrath's face grew grave and his voice dropped significantly. They are masters of interpreting information and finding its truth even when it wishes to remain unfound. They can tell a lie as soon as it's spoken. The traveler will speak to you, but the listener is the one who will judge which of you will be allowed into the city. Logan seemed oddly concerned by the news from Wrath, but he patted the black-clad man awkwardly on the shoulder and said, Thank you for everything. Wrath looked at the Anglo-Daik, but offered no response, and then Logan was gone. Caliandra lingered a moment. Can I get you anything else, Wrath? No, I will drink from the oasis when I have had a moment's rest. Caliandra saw there was nothing more to be done, so she turned back to the refugees. The Malarians, watchers as she now understood them to be, had brought long wooden poles and heavy canvas for the people of Delmore to make simple shelters. They were deposited in an open space for the group, and then the watchers simply left and rejoined their kind, or, those she imagined had been their guides to this place, went back out among the dunes to resume their duties. Grimtooth was already hefting heavy columns of wood and driving them into the earth to support the tents, and Logan was quick to join him. Diaga and Joven stood apart from the others, with Trem propped up on his elbows in the litter, taking the scene in. Caliandra walked over to join them, and it was the injured man who expressed wonder at their new accommodations. This place seems almost magical. The vibrant green of the plants, the brilliance of the water. It seems impossible amid the desert we just crossed. It does, Joven agreed. I should go help the others. He said the latter with a look at Diaga and Trem for approval or permission, and his fellow half-elf waved him away. Diaga smiled at Caliandra as she reached them. She knelt by Trem and, without asking, took his head in her hands and examined his injuries. I'm afraid your scars may never fully heal. I'd be disappointed if they did. Caliandra frowned at that, but did not reply. Diaga scanned the surroundings once more and said almost to himself, I still have not seen Neep since we arrived. I'm sure she'll come back, Trim tried to reassure him. She's been your closest companion for too long to stay away. What made her take off in the first place? There are other fire cats here, Diaga answered him. I'm not certain she's seen any since her parents died. Neither Trim nor Caliandra said anything after that. They watched the others erect the broad tents and begin to settle in. Diaga suggested they find a place for themselves, but Trim was content to remain where he was and take in the natural beauty of the place. Soon Joven, sweating heavily from the exertion of the work erecting the shelters, came back over and suggested they go down to the water and quench their thirst. With some effort, he was able to drag Trim down to the water's edge, where a lone watcher handed them small leather skins of clear liquid from the oasis. They drank deeply in silence at first, then sipped more slowly to prolong the experience. All about them they could hear the sounds of others encamped there, talking in strange tongues and occasionally approaching the watcher at the shore for a share of water. Wrath turned up briefly, moving slightly slower than normal and looking a bit stiff, but bearing several small and brightly colored fruits, several of which he gave to Joven and Trem before disappearing once more. They were citrus fruits and tanging as well as heavy with water. Trem and Joven tried them all, and in those brief moments they relaxed at last, and Trem felt the tiredness that comes with calm beginning to wash over him. Looking to his left, he saw Joven was also fading in the shade of one of the great palms. A shadow fell across them, and Trem turned. Standing over him, impassive in his expression, was an older human dressed in a dirty white shirt and faded trousers, hands on hips, studying them both. Trem squinted slightly as the sun over the man's shoulder washed over his face, and the examiner spoke. What have you brought for the wisest of Yulinar? Trem was uncertain what he was being asked, but Joven replied for him, having heard Logan recount the conversation with Wrath when they first arrived. We brought nothing, only refugees from Lagosha who lost their homes. The man snorted and shook his head in frustration. His long gray hair was matted and filthy, with no sign of any care or desire to clean it. His eyes had a wild light as he scanned the oasis, then looked back at Joven and Trem. Brought nothing, and the rumors say you'll see Yulinar before I do. Have you any idea how long I've waited while they review my offering? It's been almost 10 years, and others have waited still longer, and yet you, he thrust a dirty finger at Trem's face, arrive and are to be escorted to the streets of the wisest in Tethtanir in a matter of hours. It's disgusting. We have people in need, Trem replied evenly. Ha! The old man clapped his hands in mock praise and leaned even closer. Because you're injured or sick. Those are petty concerns. The city of Yulinar is the apex of knowledge, and nothing is more precious than that. He straightened and stared down his nose at them both. What makes you worth saving anyhow? I've watched hundreds die here waiting to get one glimpse of the great library. You should suffer before you're allowed to enter. That has always been the custom. Who says we haven't suffered? Javaneleth shot back. The old man glared at him. No one, but you haven't. I can see it on your faces. You may think you've been through hardship, but it's not truly touched you. Not yet. He looked them up and down once more, and then turned on his heel and walked briskly away. Trem watched him go thoughtfully as Joven rose from his position under the tree and came to stand near him. The two scanned the crowds of people that lined the oasis and their worn shelters, and for the first time they took in the details of their accommodations. There were parties of dwarves, elves, men of all races and lands, and some folk that were not even identifiable by their build or manner of dress. However, they were all uniformly worn and tired-looking, some with tatters where finery had once been, and many hauling about carts laden with books and unidentifiable items. Javaneleth ran a hand through his bedraggled hair and looked down at Trem. The wounded man shrugged, for what were they to do? With a nod to himself for reassurance, Joven bent down and lifted the handles of the litter, pulling Trem back towards the rest of the company. Arvadas walked past the guards and pushed open the creaking door to the vaults, surprised at its weight and girth as he did so. He had not been down in this part of the palace for many months, and he had forgotten the smell of musty parchment and leather mingled with mold and dust that could be so stifling. He realized as the door was closing that there were no torches lit in the stairwell, and indeed, it seemed they had all burned out some time ago. In the darkness he paused, unsure of what to do. Then he saw a faint flickering at the base of the staircase, and, rather than go back and ask a guard for a torch, he made his way slowly down the stone steps until he was near the light. He could hear the faint turning of a page somewhere within the vaults and knew Arindian must be there. Arvadas turned the corner and saw a brazier burning low in the middle of the first massive room. The ceilings were over 30 feet high, and every wall was lined with bookcases of equal size, covered in scrolls and ancient books. Many of them were beyond any scholar's ability to read, for they had come from the times before the Angladaic kingdom existed and were written in the oldest languages of the forgotten people. Others were simply so aged that opening them would have reduced the tomes to dust. Arvadas walked to the brazier and lifted a few hunks of wood, tossing them on the low flames and watching the light dim then begin to brighten. How long had Arindian been down here? The light was faint, but the temperature was also quite cold, and he felt dampness on his clothes. Arindian had always warned him to ensure there was plenty of wood for the braziers in the vaults, as the heat from their burning kept the vaults dry and preserved the fragile texts within. His concern growing, Arvadas began to make his way to the next chamber. He walked through the doorless alcove and into another room almost identical to the one before it. Once more, in passing, he tossed a few chords in the dimming fire there. He listened for the sound of pages turning he had sworn he'd heard before, but there was nothing. Perhaps he had imagined it. Unsure of himself and growing worried, his haste to seek Arindian's counsel now changed to a desire just to find the High Lord. Arvadas cupped his hands about his mouth and called out, "Fremont, where are you?" His voice echoed through the vaults and reverberated off the stone, but there was no answer. Arvadas looked about the room and decided to enter the opening to the left, finding the door slightly less full of books and the brazier totally unlit. Taking flint from beneath the wide iron base, he piled some wood in the metal holder and lit it after a few attempts to generate a spark. The flame fluttered and slowly shone across the room. He could see books scattered on the floor, and the tall wheeled ladders used to reach the highest shelves had stacks of papers on them. A cart used to move text from one room to another was sitting near the northern exit. Arvadas walked over to it and examined the books and papers resting on the low shelves. Then he heard the sound of a heavy object striking the floor, and then another. Following the noise, he walked swiftly through the next several rooms, each dark or barely lit, until he came at last to one of the vaults and could see bright lights within. He entered the room and saw Arindian with his back to him, standing before a long table and shuffling a number of books from one side to another. The wall sconces in this chamber were also alight, and the brazier in the center was roaring. The room was warm, unlike the cool and unwelcome environment Arvadas had felt in the others, and he saw that Arindian had masses of books piled as high as he could have reached, strewn all about the room. There were carts with scrolls and records to one side, and Arvadas noted a vast collection of what his eyes told him were histories piled in one corner. Arindian finished moving the text to either side of the massive volume at the bottom of his current interest, and Arvadas recognized its incredible girth and knew it could only be the Tome of Serestus. He walked forward, allowing the steel-coated heels of his boots to strike the stone audibly so he did not startle his friend. Incredibly, Arindian appeared not to hear him, mumbling to himself and bent over the text laid out on the table. Arvadas was worried that touching his shoulder might alarm the High Lord, so he stopped some distance away and said, "Arindian." There was no reply, and at last, his exasperation getting the better of him, the king shouted, "Arindian!" Fremont jumped and spun round in surprise, and it seemed it took a while for him to recognize who was standing before him. His robes were dusty, and Arvadas thought in some places he could see spots of mold. His hair was wild, and his eyes surrounded in dark circles that betrayed how little he must have slept. Arvadas quickly forgot his need for advice and was immediately concerned for his friend. "Fremont, how long have you been down here?" The High Lord seemed to take a long while to process the inquiry, but then he snapped out of his confusion and waved a hand dismissively. "I've lost track, but that's no matter. I'm close to understanding what's happening with the fortress in the north, and more, so much more. It's of far greater complexity than just the invasion, at least if I'm right, and I'm afraid I may be." "The fires had gone out in a number of the chambers," Arvadas said gently. "Doesn't that trouble you?" "Fires?" Arindian seemed confused, and his hand stole to an odd pendant on a thick steel chain around his neck. Arvadas had never seen it before, but at the moment it was the least of his concerns. "Oh, the fires, yes. I've not been as attentive as I should be. Shall we go relight them?" The two then went through the 20 vaults, and wherever the fires had been weakened or gone out, they relit them. The walking seemed to bring Fremont Arindian out of his mental cobwebs, and when they returned to the chamber, he was more coherent and able to understand the inquiries of Arvadas. He strode immediately back to the Tome of Serestus, beckoning the king to join him. "It has to do with the Cavern of the Ancients. I did not realize it when we were passing through that dreadful place, but its influence on Alderlast and all of Angledeus has been enormous." "What do you mean?" Arindian gestured to the pile of history texts in one corner. "Each of those describes the kings and queens of our homeland and the development of the nation, but it's just the earliest records I needed to find. The Tome of Serestus is more than just the basis upon which the code is founded. It's also an account of how the nation formed and the most complete record of what existed before, at least in a language that most people can understand." "I know the purpose of the tome, Fremont, but you don't, not really." Arindian turned the pages of the immense book until he reached what he was looking for. "Here. The text explains that Alderlast is not a city built from nothing, but constructed on the ruins of some ancient civilization that predated even our first ancestors. That came before the nation itself. Now, the High Lords of Galden have always been responsible for the architecture and planning of the city, but in fact," he turned to another page, "they were originally charged with testing the potency of the ruins using arcane magic." "Arcane magic?" Arvadas was taken aback. "But the tome specifically outlaws the use of the arcane in Angledeus. It's one of the worst crimes that any person can commit." "Yes," Arindian said, his eyes turning to Arvadas, "and those decrees appear later in the tome, but look here." He turned to another page, then flipped back several and paused, holding one hand to mark the later section, and pointing with his free one to the current script. "This outlines the discoveries made by this form of arcane experimentation, but here, before the outline of the arcane is laid down, there is a gap of almost 30 years. I tested the bindings with a letter opener, and I believe some of the pages are missing." "Missing?" "What I mean, Arvadas, is that something happened that led to the outline of the arcane, which had previously been permitted in our nation, and whatever it was, has been scrubbed from even the tome." Arvadas scratched his head and pondered this revelation. But why would we only have learned of this now? It's been in the tomes Restus the entire time. How was it not noticed before? Irindian laughed. Look at the size of the book, Arvadas. I'm not surprised my ancestors did not delve too deeply into its contents, and even if they did uncover this bit of information, what use would it be? The evil of arcane magic is a lesson burned into the mind of every Anglo-Daic child. There'd be no reason to resurrect the idea that we once embraced and used it. Arvadas considered this before pointing a determined figure at Irindian. Do not tell Galden. It's well enough he not know, but you still haven't told me what this has to do with the invaders or the fortress. I'm not certain yet, Irindian admitted, but our divine powers and faith appear useless against this new threat. Perhaps we need to understand the enemy better before we can oppose them. And what if those things we encounter beneath the dungeons are the remnants of whatever went wrong in the scrying of the ruins? It would make sense, Arvadas agreed. Those creatures were something I've never encountered before, and right under the stones of our city. If the ruins are as old as you think, maybe they are what is left of those ancient people. And maybe the use of the arcane is what revived them, and that is why there is no record of whatever occurred in those 30 years. Arvadas looked around the chamber and rubbed his chin in thought. If that's the case, you believe the magic used to make the fortress somehow reached those beings in the caves? I'm not certain. It could be that they were there all along, and by entering their domain we roused them ourselves, but I need to study the histories further, and the accounts of the Inquisitions from the past, to understand what sorts of danger the arcane posed to our people. Such records are either hard to decipher due to their age or lost, but those I've located and can understand are still of value. So you've been down here, however long, hunting for information that may or may not exist. Irindian shrugged. There's not much else I can do, and Arvadas turned as he heard a hitch in Irindian's voice and saw his hand rubbing the strange pendant once more. I need to do something. To help, of course. Excuse me. Arvadas studied his friend's almost feverish face with concern, and then placed a hand on his shoulder, and smiled. Of course, Fremont, I'm sure your work will be of use. The High Lord smiled in return, and then his brow furrowed. Sorry. But what made you come down here? Surely you're not just checking up on me. Arvadas sighed and pulled a stool out from under the table to sit on. He told Irindian of the meeting with High Lady Hladek and her veiled threats. I have to reinstate the Truth Seekers to appease her, or it may prevent Logan from ever coming back home. Of course, Arvadas, Irindian said solemnly, but I fear Varasho is in greater danger, even if she does not expose him to the public, if the Truth Seekers investigate him. I know, Arvadas said quietly. I need to find a way to keep him safely away from Alderlast. Fortunately, his duties to Renon keep him away from the capital for a time. If High Lady Hladek truly empowers this new order of hers, you may need to get him out of the nation entirely. Yes, and that's rather difficult at this point. Irindian did not answer, but stood thinking of what could be done to aid in that matter. At last he rubbed his hands together and said, I do not think that Eladria Hladek's intentions are vindictive, but she may be lighting a fire she cannot hope to control. It is true that reigniting the faith and might of our paladins and priests would give us more clout in the battles to come, but the price may be steep. Still, you should allow the reinstatement of the Truth Seekers, and not just to avoid the negative consequences for your family. If there are elements within our nation that threaten us, they'll find out. Let's hope they pursue only the truly guilty and don't try to make scapegoats of the innocent. You're thinking of Vladar Conan and the Napoleons. Irindian shook his head. They were a nation not tied to our faith as strongly as we are, Arvadas. I believe Paladinus and his children will not be overzealous. Arvadas stood and shook his head doubtfully. You act as though the gods are more level-headed than men. Have we not heard the rumors the invaders who have trapped us here follow Narath? I fear my faith may be waning, and perhaps I'm not ready to be at the head of some passionate hunt of the uninspired. Then keep a close watch on them, and High Lady Hladek, Irindian advised. Do not let them forget you're the king, and you can exercise your power when needed to curb lawlessness as you see it. Easier said than done, Irindian, but wise words nonetheless. Thank you. Arvadas took a few steps towards the door leading from the chamber, then turned. Will you join me upstairs for some refreshment? I fear you haven't eaten in some time. Oh, Irindian looked back at his piles of books and then at Arvadas. I'll come up soon, my friend. I just want to finish reviewing one portion of a historical record I found recently, before I forget what I was looking for. Arvadas watched him silently for a moment, then nodded in agreement and left the chamber. Irindian waited until he was sure his king had reached several vaults away, then exhaled mightily and his shoulders slumped. He looked down at his hand, rubbing the pendant about, and his face contorted in disgust as he wrenched it away. He strode over to the book cart containing a vast pile of scrolls, one that Arvadas had fortunately not studied too closely, and pulled one free. Holding it up to the light, he held one hand out and spoke the words on the page with a careful, practiced intonation. In his free hand, sparks of blue, crackling lightning shone out, and he flicked his wrist to the right, sending them streaking across the room and exploding one of the wall sconces and the torch within. Carefully, he set the paper down and closed his eyes. He was getting better at controlling the arcane power, and he did not feel the urge to hold the necklace when he used his invoking might. The reviving of the Truth Seekers would put him in grave danger, but he dared not tell Arvadas what he was truly involved in. The pendant was a dread curse upon Arindian, but also the possible key to salvation for his homeland. Vendile had the necklace on him when he died, and Arindian had found it. The item was a simple circular setting with 3 dark stones at the top, but oddly heavy for so minimal a design. Something about it was undeniably boring into him, doing something foul and unnatural to his body, but he also sensed it held the key to the salvation of his country. The pendant had its benefits. Arvadas would have dragged Arindian from the vaults immediately had he known how long he had truly been down there, without sleep or rest. The object kept Arindian flushed with unnatural energy even as it sapped his sanity and focus in waves that threatened to take him over entirely. The ruins, the frightening monsters beneath the dungeons, the fortress, and this dark medallion were connected somehow. Arindian was certain of it. He only hoped he could discover the thread tying them together before it was too late. He walked to the stool that Arvadas had briefly sat in, and with painstaking slowness removed the chain holding the heavily crafted circle and set it on the table. For a while he stared at it, unable to pull his gaze away. Then he turned back to his research and began the hunt for clues once more. Atop the stairs to the vaults, Arvadas paused at the door, something telling him he ought to go back and drag Arindian upstairs with him. He hesitated, then pulled the door open with a great heave and stepped quickly out into the palace halls. The guards nearby jumped slightly at his sudden appearance, and Arvadas smiled as disarmingly as he could to put them at ease. He flagged down a passing servant and pulled her aside. "Go to my study, and take whatever meal has been prepared. Bring it down to the vaults for High Lord Arindian. Make certain he eats. I'll have my own fill at home." The servant bowed and hurried off to do his bidding. Taking one last look back at the door to the vaults, Arvadas shook his head and walked swiftly down the hall, leaving Arindian to his work. Edge awoke in total blackness. His eyes, powerful as they were, could not see even the shadows of objects around him. Closing them, he tried to focus his other senses instead. He heard faint breathing nearby and stretched out his hands slowly. He felt the heavy, slightly damp cloth and strands of long hair and knew Raymir was next to him. He also felt and heard the clatter of shackles on his wrists attached to the wall behind him, and knew they were imprisoned somewhere. Sitting up as best he could, he tested the strength of their restraints and found them secure. Leaning back against the wall, he waited in vain for his eyes to adjust, but there was nothing to aid his vision, so he sat in silence. Edge was not certain how much time had passed, but it seemed hours. He heard the soft tread of steps somewhere in the distance. As they drew closer, he also heard the unearthly and unnerving cries, scrapings, and clatters of other beings within the dark hole. He could not place the origin of the quiet approach, but then a floating orb of pale light came round a bend, and he saw there were stairs, perhaps 10 feet from where he was shackled, leading up. Raymir stirred as the light appeared, and in confusion sat up and pressed closer to Edge. The orb hovered for a moment, and then the dark figure stepped in front of it, temporarily obscuring the light, and passed it by. Raymir saw in the unnatural glow the bars of a cell that held them. There was another cell on the opposite side of the small room that the stairs led to, and one apparently empty. Other than that, she could detect nothing in the room of any note, but as the orb came closer, she saw that there was another set of bars and an iron door cutting their cell in two. The figure came to the cell and stood, unmoving, the light of the sphere not revealing his or her face. An audible whirring and clicking came from the robes of their captor, and Raymir felt an unease so deep and terrible she looked away. Edge, either out of ignorance or bravery, shifted to face the warden of the cells, as best he could. "Why have you trapped us in here?" he demanded. "We've done nothing wrong." "Truly," the voice crackled like crumpling parchment, and it seemed old and dusty as well. "Then why did you steal up to my home, alone and armed with stealth and guile? If you meant no harm, surely you would have announced your arrival." Edge was unsure how to respond, but Raymir, perhaps deciding defiance was the better course of action, said, "We killed Saltillion. He was coming here to find you. We want to know what's going on in this place." The cloaked head jerked unnaturally to face Raymir, and a wheezing laugh escaped with a tinny echo from a metallic mask. "Saltillion, the minor wizard from Nepal City. Do you expect that to intimidate me, child?" More laughter oozed out of the mask, and the figure held forth its hand, and the light floated into the chamber, but still refused to fully illuminate their captor. "As for why you are here, it is simple. You can be of some small use to me. You see the gate just before you. Past that lies my masterpiece, and you will sustain him, so that he might grow strong and serve me one day." Raymir squinted, trying to penetrate the blackness of the room across from where they were bound, but it was too dark. Then something moved in the inky void. She heard the scrape of cloth and skin on stone. She could not tell what had made the sound. It caused a clinging fearfulness to rise within her. Edge was watching too, and she saw him swallow in rare nervousness and flex to test the bonds once more. "There's no need to fight," the unearthly voice said. "The chains will not bend no matter how you struggle. This is not a place for the brawn of men. It is a sanctum of the unnatural and the unseen, and you will be sacrificed to the betterment of that most holy and aged tradition. It will be horrific, I'm sure, but you can take some solace in the immensity of the beings your death will nurture. Raymer reached out with a simple spell she'd learned some time ago, trying to see if she could unhinge the manacles on her wrists. Instead, a sharp and terrible pain raced through her whole body, as if her skin was on fire, and then it spread deeper into her veins beneath. She cried out and curled into a ball as it washed over her, and the masked figure crouched low in curiosity. So you have something of the spark in you. Intriguing. I wonder if that shall entice my child more than usual. Their tormentor was gone then, the magical light following the figure up the stairs and leaving them in impenetrable darkness once more. A moment later, Edge heard the creak of the latch across from them, and the door swung open slowly with a terrible, elongated screech of rusted hinges. He braced himself, trying to protect Raymer's form beside him, but nothing more happened. Then he heard a steady, deep, and powerful sequence of breaths coming from deep inside the other cell. He listened only briefly, then sensing nothing was going to come out of the darkness, he spoke. Is someone there? There was a sharp but controlled intake of breath, then a resumption of the rhythmic breathing from before. Edge leaned forward a bit more and tried to pierce the darkness. He thought he saw two small pinpoints of light that might have been eyes looking back at him, but it was impossible to be sure. Then a deep and ancient-sounding voice rolled out to him. Stay as far back as you can. I'm not bound. Edge somehow felt even more fear wash over him when the voice came through the cell than when their fearsome captor had threatened them earlier. He obeyed and pushed himself back against the stone wall. Raymer, her body no longer writhing in pain, scuttled away on her boots, but leaned her head forward, curiosity getting the better of her. What do you mean you're not bound? Are you not a prisoner? A great and lingering sigh, more an exhalation of long-held breath, came from the other side of the room. Raymer caught the scent of death on it, and she recoiled a bit, but craned her head forward, awaiting a response. The voice came again. I am, but I am not. I was made by Valroth, the devil that just came to mock and torment you. I do not have any recollection of what I was before. I knew once, but he's driven it from me. What are you now? Edge asked. That I also do not know. Why are we here? With you, I mean. You are here for me to feed upon. The response, cold and simply stated, chilled Edge to his bones. He reached as far as the chains in the wall would allow and grasped Raymer's arm, but she seemed less horrified by their predicament. With a surprising gentleness, she said, I feel from your tone you don't want to do this. I do not. But you will. I must. Raymer said nothing for a moment, then quietly asked, What if we were to help you escape? What if we all escaped together? Edge elbowed her in an attempt to quiet her down, but Raymer hit him back and hissed, He may be our only way out. He's meant to devour us, Edge whispered back. Yes, that is true, the voice said calmly, and do not bother whispering. I can hear everything you say. I can hear your breath as it enters and leaves your lungs, hear the rustle of every piece of cloth and metal on your bodies, and the very pulsation of blood. The voice faltered a bit, and a shuddering breath came free before it continued. Blood in your veins. There is no reason to hide your thoughts from me. I do not wish you harm, and I would dearly want my freedom, but there is no way. Raymer could hear the sadness then, and beneath it, immense rage in the voice across from them. Despite her fear in their situation, she felt an incredible sadness for whatever was sealed in the cell along with her and Edge. She adjusted her position a bit and leaned forward, coming away from the wall despite being warned not to. There has to be a way. The chains are magical, but what if I could undo the spell? Are you a wizard? The voice had the faintest hint of hope. Raymer hesitated before deciding it was best not to lie. I'm more of an apprentice. I've studied some magic, but I'm in no way adept. A long sigh came from the other side once more, but then there was a return to the rhythmic breathing, and after a moment the voice came echoing across to them thoughtfully. There may be something that can be done. I have grown more attuned to the arcane as I've fed and grown stronger. I can feel the wards in this place, and I can see the ways they might be unbound. I have the power to do it, but any attempt would bring me only pain, which would disrupt my efforts and break concentration before I could free myself. But if you have enough strength within you, I might be able to channel my magic through you and undo the wards. It would mean you would have to suffer the pain they cause, which could be crippling if it lasts too long. Raymer swallowed as she thought of how unbearable even the brief flash of feedback had been when she tested her spell before. Then she thought of Edge and how they would never make it out of here if she did not do something. I'll let you try. Edge stiffened next to her but said nothing. The long and drawn-out exhalation came from the cell across from them once more, and the rhythmic breathing quickened. It's no use. I would need to touch you, and to come so close would drive me to strike and feast. There's nothing to be done. Raymer would not allow their lone chance to evaporate so swiftly. Nothing. Do you not hate Valroth for what he's done to you? Would you not try anything to stop him? Yes. The voice boomed off of the stones around them, and Edge swore he felt the entire tower shake as their fellow prisoner roared. He has made me from the bones and ashes of whatever I once was, exposing me to the truths of the universe and horrors about us in layers slowly peeled away to reveal the madness all around. He's tormented me with blood of innocence, the lives of those taken from unknowing parents, and the damning knowledge that what he has infested me with will make consuming those doomed captives a necessity I cannot avoid. I will see him unmade one day. Then let us help you, Raymer said earnestly. There has to be a way. There was a silence, marred only by heavy and rapid breathing in the far cell. Then it slowed, gradually becoming more spaced apart and steady. At last, in far greater calm, the voice said, "There may be a way. Soon he will come to take me for his dark experiments, and I may find a way to feed on something else so that I can sate my lust long enough we can attempt to break free." There was another long stretch of quiet, and then a soft whisper came through the bars of the other cell. "Rest, and I will meditate and keep my distance." The finality of the statement made it clear there was no further discussion. Raymer sat back as best he could. Edge wrapped one chained arm around her shoulders. She leaned her head against him and whispered softly, "We have to try to stay awake. I know. You sleep first. I've been out longer." Edge did not protest, but he found it was some time before he could even close his eyes. He searched in vain through the darkness, trying to discern anything of the room about them. He finally gave up, but even when he closed his eyes, he could hear the steady, rhythmic breathing, and its perfect pattern of inhaling and exhaling so unnerved him that it was all he could focus on as they sat in the pitch black and waited. Sword Mistress Felissa Ulfrin walked out of the mess tent in the broken camp and stretched her arms above her head, refreshed by the biting cold wind that swirled through the air. She missed the depths of winter in the north, but those stark and powerful breezes across the dust plains were close enough to make her almost nostalgic. They had advanced a mere 100 miles in the last month, just pushing west and finding nothing more to supply the army, being forced to send men foraging and raiding to supply the great mass and avoid desertions. They could have moved faster if they had not been laden down with wounded and frustrated soldiers, with Gornath working to quell the dissent among his men after the messy execution of several rivals at Delmore. Things had been plotting for certain, frustrating Hrothgar as well as Velissa, both of whom were under orders to reach Dragon's Watch far to the west as soon as they could. The day's forays in the countryside had yielded a rare caravan, one wagon laden with cheap ales and meads, leading to the consumption of great quantities of alcohol among the men to ease the tension in the army. Velissa stumbled a bit as she took her first steps, drunk from the foul ale that had been served in vast amounts in the rowdiness of one of the large mess tents that provided for all the soldiers in the army. Their numbers had been growing in small chunks every day, and Velissa was pleased that they had been able to replace the men lost at Delmore. She was less happy about the quality of those who had joined, mostly criminals and cutthroats or those who had aspired to such evils. Even the large quantity of alcohol she had drunk that night would not wash out the foulness of the reputation among those she was now helping to command. It bothered Hrothgar not at all, perhaps even less than it did Gornath, who was little better than a common murderer himself, albeit a canny one. Velissa walked unsteadily across the camp to reach her private quarters, a smaller tent set up on the outskirts of the vast army. She regretted having placed it so far from the center of their formation now, because the walk was more difficult than she expected, and she was having trouble seeing clearly. When she thought she had gone half the distance, she realized that a more pressing concern was about to take hold of her. Leaning up against the closest tent, she vomited into the dirt. She went to wipe her mouth with the back of her hand and felt another surge as she once again released the evening's indulgences to the ground. Leaning against a tent pole, waiting to see if she had fully ejected the cheap booze roiling in her stomach, she heard voices from the other side of the tent, where the light of a campfire was visible. Gaining her balance, she took a step forward and listened. "I know it's all we can do, but I wish it was possible to go back north. We were north, and if we go back now, we'll be captured and executed as traitors. But we're fighting in their damned army now." The latest voice was exasperated. "As much as you can call it an army, it's a rabble of criminals. What else can we do? If we don't fight here, we have to go somewhere else, and there's enough of our own kind here. I'd rather be with people I know, fighting, than trying to make it south on what we can forage. Or joining that self-righteous order to the west. At least here we might make enough coin to carve out a piece of land to start over." Velissa recognized the voices, and composing herself as best she could, she walked around the tent and said loudly, "Gale or tempest?" There were 5 men seated around the campfire, and all immediately grabbed swords and stood defensively facing her. Some relaxed when they saw Velissa did not appear armed, but the oldest, a man of about 40, stepped forward with his blade still pointed at her. "What was that?" "Were you servants to House Gale or House Tempest? The accents of Cresswinders are among the most distinct in all of Nepal, and I knew many of them when I was aiding my father in Tianis." The group relaxed somewhat, but the one in the lead seemed to realize who was addressing them. "Thane Ulfrin, I apologize, I did not know it was you." Velissa walked around the fire, eyeing each of the men in turn. "No apology necessary. I'd heard there were many men from Nepal that had fled south and joined our army. I did not realize some of you had traveled so far to join a rabble of criminals." The man who had made the observation held up his hands and tried to recover from his earlier statement. "Now, Sword Mistress, I did not mean—" "Of course you did, and you're right." Velissa stepped forward and took a spoon from the pot that had been simmering over the fire. She tasted the contents, wrinkled her nose, and set it back. "We're a ragtag bunch of amateurs, except you're not. You're fighting men of Nepal." They said nothing, but all eyes were on her. "If I were to offer you a chance to join a unit of only your own countrymen, would you do it?" "That depends," the older man said evenly. "What do we have to do for you?" "Be loyal," Velissa said, turning to face him. "Swear to become housecarls of Ulfrin and answer only to me. Not to the raider and his pet knoll, not to that sniveling rat Hrothgar, only to me." She crossed her arms and tried to assume a commanding stance, though the nausea was threatening to return once more. You do that, and I will see to it you're well rewarded. There'll be lands to claim in Dragon's Watch when this is over, and you can have your pick of them, if you serve me well. The group looked at one another in turn, then the leader stared at Valissa a moment before finally saying, All right, Sword Mistress, you have our loyalty. Good, Valissa smiled. Gather up any other Napoleons you think would be of service. I want an entire platoon of soldiers from our homeland under my direct command. Do well, and I will ensure you are all given positions of high rank. Without waiting for a response, Valissa turned and strode hurriedly to her tent. Her gait was less circuitous now, but she felt gorge rising in her throat again, and had to stop and vomit once more before reaching her quarters. She waved away the guards outside and stumbled in, collapsing on her pile of animal furs in the heap. She knew the next morning was certain to be a painful one, but her journey back from trying to drown her frustrations had given her an unexpected opportunity. Rolling over onto her side, she pulled one of the large bearskins over her shoulders and let unconsciousness take her. That's Chapter 4. I will pick up with Chapter 5 probably tomorrow, if not tomorrow on Monday. As always, you can follow me on at Legacy Chronicle on Twitter. And you can also subscribe to this channel and check out YouTube, where I'm going to be uploading the last couple chapters to in a few hours. So enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thanks for listening.